my name is Deena Dajani. I'm a research associate on the Oecumene project, and I'm honored to be interviewing our keynote speaker to our second symposium today, Professor Saba Mahmood, who's Professor of Sociocultural Anthropology at Berkeley. And I think I'll begin with asking about the article you co-authored with Charles Hirschkin 10 years ago, in which you outlined how the twin figures of the Islamic fundamentalist and his female victim were used to popularize support for the war in Afghanistan as being in Afghani's best interest. In the article, you were concerned with the selective appropriation of the conditions of oppression affecting Afghan women as articulated by the feminist majority. And you asked why were conditions of war, militarization, and starvation considered to be less injurious to women than the lack of education, employment, and most notably in the media campaign, Western dress style. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on the recent shooting of Malala Yousafzai by the Taliban in Pakistan, and how Malala's act can be thought of in ways that challenge representations of her shooting.
Well, I just want to first of all say that it's really tragic as to how she was both targeted and victimized by what is clearly a really bankrupt and an extreme ideology, and that was in fact also condemned by the majority of political parties, including the Islamic political parties in Pakistan. And in fact, there was a very large mobilization where in a long time, liberal and Muslim voices galvanized and united to register their protest of this really barbaric act that the Pakistani Taliban committed. And it is very clear to me that what's so salutary about this figure of 14-year-old young woman is that she comes from precisely those same tribal family structures that the Taliban claim from, but offers a very different kind of a vision of what it means for women to be educated. As you know, in many of the interviews that were shown in the world around before she was shot, she was veiled. And yet she did not stand against women's education. She laid her life down for it. So we should really, in this moment, rethink the kind of standard consensus that exists in the media, particularly in Europe, that to be veiled is to be in nothing other than a fundamentalist Muslim. For a woman to be veiled in this moment is to stand on the side of fundamentalist Islam. And of course, fundamentalist Islam is never complicated. It is just used as a larger term for everybody from the likes of the Pakistan Taliban to Afghan Taliban to women who wear the veil, for example, in France and want to fight for the right to wear the veil in France, or the Muslim citizens in Britain here. And we don't really capture the complexity of what it means to wear the veil and still not be, those women do not consider themselves to be fundamentalist in the mold of the Pakistani Taliban. And clearly the figure of Malala is one that shows us that women can choose to be both, can choose to veil, but they can also fight for the right of education. And so this bugaboo that Western media and European media have created of Islamic fundamentalism, to which all veiled women belong, must be questioned and challenged to really understand then what is the significance of a figure like her.
Thank you. And your works often draw on the relationship between political subjectivity and Orientalism to render as parochial key assumptions within feminist theory and secular liberalism. And I was wondering how you think the relationship between political subjectivity and Orientalism operate differently, if they do, in assumptions about women's moral reform movements, for example, and in strategies of religious minority management.
Those are different things altogether. You're asking me two different questions, essentially. You're asking me about women's reform movements. By that, I assume you're talking about the Muslim reform movement on which I worked in Egypt. And then you're asking me about the management of religious difference, which is a different book and a different project that I'm currently working on, which has little to do with Muslim women's subjectivity, but actually is focused on Coptic Christian relations with Muslim majority in Egypt, and generally about Muslim and Christian relations in the Middle East. So I just want to take those apart and think of those separately, rather, because they really belong to two different analytical frameworks and two different sets of analytical questions. The question about women's reform movements, I think it's important to realize there is that what I tried to say in my book, Politics of Piety, was that we assume that women who are following Orthodox religious practices are necessarily, therefore, working against their own self-interests because they're not furthering their autonomy. And what I was trying to suggest was that the idea that autonomy, the desire to choose for oneself against custom, religion, tradition, society, is a very parochial desire. It certainly does not capture the ambit of desires that animate a person in achieving what they do. So if we cannot really think of our own actions in those terms, that all of our actions are motivated by a desire for maximizing autonomy, then how is it that we can project that onto the world and try to understand movements such as the Muslim piety movement, in which women are really actually trying to submit to God in order to be able to determine their own freedom, not freedom of autonomy, but freedom to submit themselves to a higher authority. This seems to pose a problem within a particular framework, i.e. the liberal individualist framework. And so I was trying to really think against this normative notion that the desire to be free from domination and for maximization of autonomy is a universal desire that can then help us say, oh, this movement is good and this movement is bad. It does not really help us understand what the desires of those movements are. So I was trying to therefore problematize not just feminism, Western liberal feminism, but feminism as such, even post-colonial feminism, and trying to think about that. As regards to the project about the management of religious difference in contemporary states, modern states, that belongs to a different research project that I'm working on. I'm particularly concerned with the right to religious freedom of non-Muslim minorities in the Middle East, and trying to think of what is the longer history by which this current impasse between Muslims and Christians has been produced. That again, it is not just a product of culture or a product of the intolerance of Islam. It is actually a much more complicated terrain in which the modern secular nationalist state plays a huge role in making this seem like a sectarian conflict right now.
Okay. Well, I know you've insisted on the idea of them being analytic separate projects, but if we sort of, drawing on your earlier focus on piety, and then if we can consider your focus now on secularism, do you think one can speak of the emergence of post-secular political subjectivity?
You know, I understand that post-secular as a term was actually famously coined by Habermas in the last 5 to 6 years, and it's sort of used as a means of suggesting that somehow we have moved beyond the assumptions of the secular. And I really don't think that's what's happened in the world. If anything, I think we need to actually think about what the secular is in the post. In much the same way that people were using the term post-modernity without necessarily thinking analytically and historically about what modernity meant. Now, there was a lot of discourse on modernity, intellectual, philosophical, and so on, but there is really a paucity of analytical writing on what secularism means. And so I think instead of just suddenly moving to a new horizon, we need to actually think about what is the valence of the secular? Is a secular as an epistemology, political secularism as a principle of the state, and then secularity as a cultural sensibility that undergirds a lot of the political practices of secularism, but of which we are not necessarily aware of. So the secularity and political secularism, just to begin to unpack that is enough of a project for me. So I'm very, very reluctant to embrace the term post-secular.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.